Uh, feel a little flattened, but it's all too appropriate this weekend. There's weeks where some of you like spill a drink on a customer, or like miss a bid by thousands of dollars, or hit your thumb with a hammer. This is my weekend to like forget the Lord's Prayer and mess up all kinds of stuff. So there we go. But welcome. So back in November, December, we did a series. We were having this conversation that we called Something About Mary. And really the design of that season was we just made a couple observations from Mary's life, like Mary, the mother of Jesus. That like God called her to what she thought was plan A, but in fact he called her to plan B. Remember we talked about this in terms of like she said yes to plan A, but God wasn't calling her to plan A, he was calling her to plan B. And we spent this whole kind of emotional season, at least I know it was for me, where we were just asking these questions about like, okay, so how did she navigate those disappointing, painful, discouraging, scary waters? And one of the observations that we made as we got really close to Christmas was that she didn't wrestle with entitlement. That for her, quick and easy success wasn't something she expected out of life. And it was then that I then teased out what was coming, what I said then was a parenting series that we thought was just around the corner. My intentions were that we would do a parenting series in about March. And then it struck us like, well, you can't do a marriage series and a parenting series because then like all the single people will hate us. So you can't do that. And so we just kind of kept pushing and pushing. And part of the reason why I was pushing was there's a lot of reluctance in me to lead a parenting series. Because quite frankly, like my oldest kid is 7 years old. I've got nothing to say about parenting, right? Like other than how to change a diaper and how to give a timeout. Like there's no accomplishments, no badges on my vest that I don't have a vest, but you know what I mean. And quite frankly, many of you would be much more qualified to teach such a series than I would ever dream of teaching. In fact, this week I was thinking about this whole idea, and it's just really uncomfortable. Like marriage series are uncomfortable, parenting series are uncomfortable. I was thinking about that this week, and so your brain starts going like, what was my biggest failure as a parent? And the memories, it's probably not my biggest, but one of the more vivid memories was when Lincoln was about 1.5 years old, so he was our only. We bought this house in Billings that was built in 1910 and hadn't been painted since 1911. We literally like 25 gallons of paint into the inside of the thing, and the outside of it had that really cool, really thin siding that you didn't dare take a power washer to, and so it literally took us with some friends 4 years to paint the deal. Well, at the beginning of that project, the porch, it had one of those cool porches that kind of wrapped around with the porch swing on the side. The porch was in shambles, like paint chips everywhere, and right there's no lead paint in 1910, right? So I don't know what we're dealing with. So I decided, I think Teresa was at work, decided that Lincoln and I were gonna start painting the porch, which involved getting the 5-gallon bucket of Kills primer that I had and taking him out on the porch. And I thought I'd be the fun dad, which I'm not, but I wanted to be that day, where I just let him hang out in his diaper, and I handed him a paintbrush, and I grabbed a roller, because all I'm going to do is dump the Kills on the porch, right? And like I'm just going to do the floor. And so we went to work, and my thinking was, like, when you get paint on yourself, you take a shower an hour later, and as long as there's no hair interfering with their paint, it's a pretty pain-free process, right? And so I'm thinking I'll throw him in the bathtub an hour later and rub him down, and he'll be good, and we'll have had a fun morning together. There were some things about primer that I didn't know. So we did all of that, and about 2 hours later, an hour and a half later, I don't remember, I just remember throwing him in the bathtub, and I kind of got the sense, like, not really sitting on the surface. Threw him in the bathtub, let it soak for 20 minutes. Didn't seem like much headway was being done. Grabbed the bleach, dumped some of that in there. And so I started scrubbing on his skin, and it wasn't coming off. And then, that new parent panic comes over, because I remember that we had a family event that night. So I didn't want to go to jail, nor did I, right? It didn't come off, and I was able to scrub good portions of it off, but he still looked like a victim of nuclear fallout or something. And I remember my uncle, who I have a fun relationship with, he asked me that night, he's like, so Adam, what's with Lincoln? Like, what happened? I was like, well, and I kind of explained the whole deal, and he's like, so you know there's a difference between primer and paint, right? Yeah, the primer goes on first and then the paint. Yeah, and it was then that he explained to me that primer is designed to penetrate, kind of like stain, like it's designed to find the pores and infiltrate them. And point is, I'm a bad parent, or at least not qualified to do a parenting series. And to be perfectly honest and candid with you, in my mind, this has really evolved from a parenting series to a culture series. What did happen to me was I stumbled upon some data that for me has raised a lot of different questions about myself, about us as a culture, about parenting, about my marriage. It's just, I've stumbled upon some data where essentially this one particular guy named Tim Elmore, who is a student of culture, and in particular a student of high school students and early college students. And he has leadership influence over that age group and has for a few decades. There's some data in there that is what inspired me to go let's do a parenting series, and yet in hindsight, it's far more a culture series. Because really the design of the next several weeks, and we're going to break it up quite a bit because we've got all these random things going on in between that we're excited about, really I think it's an opportunity to ask some maybe invasive questions about the way culture's impacting you. And I understand that it can be really hard to talk about culture without sounding like, that guy, the angry, it's hard to not talk about culture without sounding like a Mennonite kind of a deal, right? And that's not my intention. Not that there's anything wrong with being a Mennonite. I used to be one, but not anymore. There's not much to laugh at this morning, so you're going to have to take advantage of it when you get the chance. It's a chance, similar to what we did with Fearing God, where we went, it's a chance to rock back and go, Lord, have I become too cavalier in my relationship with you? I think this is a season, whether you're a parent or a student, whether you're an empty nester or someone that hopes to never have kids, I think it's bigger than parenting. It's a chance to just rock back on your heels and go, how is culture influencing me? And is that for the better or for the worse? And it's probably going to be both, and to therefore kind of pick through some of that stuff. Andy Crouch, who's a thinker, a Christ follower who has a lot of influence at Harvard University, and so thus a very intelligent guy. He wrote an article a few years ago about the way Christians, Christ followers, engage culture. And he suggested that in the 1960s, the posture that Christians take, and that's kind of the word picture he uses, the postures that they took was that they critiqued culture. And led largely by guys like Francis Schaeffer and some other brilliant thinkers, that what Christians did was they were constantly having these worldview conversations. And we would go to movies, and we would listen to music, and the conversation was always what was the worldview of that film? What was the worldview of that movie? And what's the worldview of Christians? And therefore there was this constant critiquing conversation happening. He then suggests that in the 70s and into the 80s, it moved from critiquing to copying. That in fact what Christians stopped doing was critiquing, and in the name of relevance, they started copying culture. And this is where we get Christian coffee shops and Christian businessmen and Christian businesswomen and Christian books and Christian music. This is where you get the idea that I would say Christian makes a great noun and a terrible adjective, but this is where it came from. He says then it moved from copying to simply consuming. In fact, his kind of prophetic challenge to us today would be, we're no longer critiquing and we're no longer copying, that Christians just consume culture like the rest of culture without really any thought to the way it's affecting us or influencing us. And of course, his challenge is that the right posture, the ideal posture, is to be one that's creating culture. And this is real central to who we are as a church. We don't want to critique it, and we don't want to copy it, and we don't want to condemn it, and we don't want to just consume it, but we want to be on the front edge in our community of influencing and creating culture. My point is, I think this is a season to just, again, kind of analyze, what is the posture that I have towards culture? C.S. Lewis, one of the greatest Christian minds of the 20th century, is reported to have been very passionate about the importance of people who wanted to follow Jesus reading books, right? Because there weren't podcasts then. Reading books written by men and women and men who were from a different era than the one in which we lived. And his point was, there are certain things about our culture that we can't see. And if we want to know, for better or for worse, how that culture is influencing our take on life and Christ and beauty and love and all of those other things, we've got to step out of our current culture and listen to the voices outside of it. I guess, bottom line, that's what I'm hoping we can do in this series, is to, in a real similar fashion, essentially say, here is what the experts are saying about this particular generation of people. And in it is an opportunity not to point a finger, but to recognize that college students and high school students and even preteens, they're reflecting back to us what is our value system. It's a classic, take the big old thing out of your own eye before you try to take the little one out of somebody else's, right? So we're calling the series IY. IY refers to a generation, it's a subcategory of a generation of people more commonly referred to as the millennials. Now, when you get into this stuff, there's always debate about when did they start and when they end, and I realize that none of this stuff is as clean as conversations like this present it as. But millennials, if you were to take the earliest possible date and the latest possible date, gives you a generation that spans from 1977 to 2002. And yet what people who are studying these guys and generations before them are telling us is that within the millennial generation, there's actually great disparity between the older members of that generation and the younger members. And so for the sake of our conversation, those born from 77 through 1989 would just be Generation Y. And while they have a lot in common with their younger counterparts, 1990 to 2002, they also have a lot of differences. And those differences are really created by the one thing, and that one thing is the source of the small I in the IY. It's the internet. Like the internet is creating incredible disparity. Not better, not worse, just different. Think of it this way. Can you remember a day when you didn't surf the internet? How many of you can remember such a day? Yeah. I can too. I don't feel that old. I'm 32 years old. The first time I got on the internet was the spring of my senior year of high school. And when I say that, I'm like, oh, geez, I am old, right? Like some of you are going like CDs. It was 8 tracks for me. Like for me, it's like internet, right? Senior year. Got a library pass from study hall because that's what you do in the spring of your senior years. You take study hall and you go to the library. And I sat down in front of this computer and I clicked on this little, I'm all but positive it was Netscape. Clicked on this little N and I got on the internet. And my next memory of getting on the internet doesn't come until I went to college 2 years later, which means I didn't go to college right out of high school. Or can you remember when you didn't get an email? Do you remember when you didn't carry around this thing in your pocket that incessantly barks at you? Remember that? Or some of you, remember there was that girl? She had the bag phone, and it was like, she is so cool because she's got a car phone. Remember that? The point is that I'm old, and those of you that are less than 19 are cool. Really, the point is that obviously Generation IY can't remember that day. And what it gets at is just like it's really hard for us to step back and have a conversation about how the telephone influenced our spirituality and our relationships, it's equally as difficult for IY to understand how the internet is affecting who they are, because it's so central to who they are. Some data about IYers. First of all, it's the biggest generation on the planet. 2 billion people of the 6+ billion on the globe are a member of that kind of subcategory of millennials called IY. In the United States, immigration is a wild card, of course, but the guys that I've been looking at are saying that with immigration, IYers will reach 100 million people, which in today's proportions would be 1/3 of our country's population. Now, the significance of that is the boomers, they're retiring, right? What they're saying then is that there are remarkable voids in the marketplace, in government, in church, in community. There are remarkable voids being left by the boomers. And that the IYers will lead earlier, they'll be younger, and they'll have greater influence than perhaps any generation within any of our memory. The point then becomes, wow. Like, I know it's cliche to say, like, the future's in their hands, but what the guys that I'm reading are saying, and it kind of caught my attention in a way stuff like this normally doesn't, is the way they lead is really going to matter over the course of the next 50 years or so of our country. Other unique things are that the IYers have experienced something that's pretty foreign to most all other generations, something called adolescence. Like, it wasn't that long ago that one day you were a kid and the next day you were an adult. Like my dad, he was really passionate about my getting to play sports when I was in high school. And I recall that the rationale was that he was decent at sports when he was in junior high, but when he got to be a freshman and when he turned 14, those of you from that generation, what did you have to do? You had to get a job. If you wanted any money, you had to get a job. And for some, you had to help support the family. Like that transition from childhood to adulthood, a day. Should I switch packs? Joe thinks it's this. A single day. Today, and I could point you to several different sources, they're saying that among males, 27 is the new 18. That no longer do we have bar mitzvah, no longer like in mainline Protestants do we have confirmation. Like, it's a span of about 15 years today. this thing called adolescence. And thus the conversation becomes like this again, not good, not bad, like, okay, so there's a whole new set of waters to navigate. The other aspect of all of that is no generation has spent less time. Now we're just talking pure numbers. This isn't theory, this isn't opinion. No generation has spent less time with adults than have iWires. Why? Because they don't need adults for their information. They don't need teachers for their information in lots of cases. The internet and the media gives them information, and so iWires spend more time with peers than has any other generation ever. So in a couple weeks, on June 26th, we're going to kind of dive into that on a deeper level and talk about the ins and the outs of that, and have conversations about what do we do with that. The other thing is, of course, they're saying parenting has changed. And to just put it as succinctly as I know how, they're saying that Gen X and those before them, they were raised with a parenting philosophy that said, our job is to prepare them for the world. What they're saying is that's flipped, and that the prevailing attitude now is that our job is to prepare the world for them. And you can see all kinds of cliches that play into that. And again, like my point, if you're a student, isn't to talk about you, but to talk at you. To let you have conversation about with yourself and with God and with people you love and respect, and go like, okay, it says I'm going this way. Is that the way I want to go? And for all of us to say, if they're headed this way, well, the youth are who we worship in our culture. If they're headed that way, so are we. This morning, what I want to do, kind of by way of introduction in terms of like, okay, so there's lots of facts. Where does this land on a practical level? There's two questions that I want to kind of pose to you. Tim Elmore suggests that there's a few words that really summarize this generation. The words overwhelmed would be one of them, and overconnected the other. I just want to pose you this question, and then another. They say that they're overwhelmed. Are yours? Are your kids? And again, our brains gravitate to like 15-year-olds and 18-year-olds, like 10-year-olds. They say they're overwhelmed. Are yours? And not only are your kids, but are you? Now, I understand that there's this cynical tendency, and maybe it's just in me, but I sense that you're cynical too if you like hanging out with me because I'm cynical. That's to go like, wait a minute, like we were all overwhelmed when we were 18. Like all of us were. And so to start having this big cry party about how overwhelming it is to be 19 today, like you can kind of push back on that. Like who of us would want to be 18 again, right? Like, and who was it that said that those were the best years of your life? Because they're crazy. 30s are a blast, right? 20s, a blast. No offense, but don't want to be 18 again, do you? Maybe the point isn't it's any harder today than it was then. Maybe the point is that culture is moving forward in such a way that there's an understanding and an appreciation and an empathy that's unlike anything that was when you were there. Maybe the point isn't to get all offended and say, like, they don't have it any harder than I do. Maybe the point is to say, like, okay, so I can help them. Whether those are your kids or a high school student that you work with, it doesn't matter. Like, maybe we can help them in ways we weren't helped. Not in a, like, pouty way, just in a positive way. The source of being overwhelmed, of course, has a few different sources, and they vary from person to person. The first thing that you can spend a lot of energy reading about is that they're overwhelmed because of the pressure they feel from their parents. This gets into the cliche, like, I wear my dad's identity. It's my job to fulfill his dreams, and certainly that's part of it. Another whole group is stressed, not because they have too much pressure from their parents, but because they don't have any. And what they're saying is that there are 20-somethings, depression, by the way, among 18-year-olds off the charts. And what they're saying, it's not always because there's a parent who's riding them too hard. It's because they grew up in an environment where there was never any riding going on, so to speak. And life gets overwhelming outside of the home, but because the responsibility in the home was far too light. So, and then of course the third type is just purely competitive, internal. We live in a smaller world. It's a lot harder to get to the top, all those different things. It's intrinsic stuff. There's a survey that I read conducted among college students who had just finished their freshman year, iWires. They said that for every one that said, I feel the pressure to participate in drugs and alcohol when I moved away and went to college, there were 4 who said, I feel pressure to get good grades. For every one that said, I feel pressure with regards to sex and drugs and alcohol, there were 6 who said, I'm overwhelmed at figuring out when to get enough sleep and how to get enough sleep. They say that they're overwhelmed, and if they are, chances are we are. And the only thing I know to do here is to retreat, if you will, and just consider Christ. I mean, we're a Christ-following movement, which means that we firmly believe that life at its best is found in Jesus. And I just want to remind you what for some of you will be very familiar words. Others, not so much, and that's fine too. In Matthew 11, in the TNAV, it says it this way, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." Now, a yoke here, we often think of something that goes around an ox. That's not necessarily what he's talking about. A yoke is like a bent. It's a philosophy. In the rabbinic world, this rabbi had his yoke and that rabbi had his yoke. And so a yoke refers to a way of living. And what Jesus is saying is my yoke is not overwhelming. My yoke is not stressful. My yoke, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus steps into this crazy dichotomy where he demands everything, and yet it's supposed to be easy and light. In the Message, it says it this way: "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it." Love this sentence here. "Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." They say we're overwhelmed, which tells me that we might believe Jesus' creeds, but it's all too easy to lose touch with a relationship with him. Because he says, man, learn the unforced rhythms of life. Does that mean we're not busy? I hope not. Like, people will say to me, "You must be busy." And I refuse to even acknowledge the question because, like, I understand it's a compliment. We're all busy. Like, who here sits around and goes like, "I'm not busy"? Nobody, right? Like, it's not about not being busy. It's about, like, following Christ and knowing these unforced rhythms of grace in the midst of that. Second is they say they're overconnected. Are your kids overconnected? And to that end, we've got a funny, or maybe open to interpretation
So here's
video.
one good reason why you should always be aware of your surroundings when texting. Let's watch this.
Then she gets out and all awkwardly walks away.
Oh my god. Play it back, do it again.
Oh, I gotta show
And
you.
she just leaves.
I gotta show you the other angle today.
Oh my god, that was today?
Yep.
So there she goes. And boom!
Okay, that's
Is there
good.
water? Is there water in there too?
Oh.
You laugh because you've almost been hit by a car texting, right? They say they're overconnected. Are you? And by overconnected, of course, we're talking about text messaging, we're talking about Facebook, we're talking about email, we're talking about the internet and all that comes with media technology. Now, none of it's bad, right? That's not the point, is to say that any of it's bad. What they're saying is we're overconnected. In some ways, it feeds antisocial behavior. It's a coping mechanism. I don't like who I am. I can become someone else online. But I don't know that that's the bigger of the factors. The bigger one is it's just simply there's always something buzzing, always something barking. There's always emails to be answered. Like, it wasn't that long ago where on your day off, if you went to the lake, no one could find you. But now, because you carry this device on your hip, not only can they better be able to, right? And we do this constantly. Now, none of that's bad. Here's one way to think about it, though. What happens? What happens if we lose the art of solitude? Because don't some of your best decisions, don't they come out of these times where you disconnected and you went for a hike or you went for a run or you laid in bed in silence? Like, don't some of your greatest insights from the Lord come when you're disconnected? Like, what happens if we lose the art of solitude, of those moments where God gives us insight about ourselves and about others? One of the things that happens is we become parrots. And none of us wants to admit this, but it means we don't ever have a creative idea of our own. All we're ever doing is repeating stuff that we heard from the media and from peers. And here again, Jesus, to me, his example is so rich and so prophetic. You can think of this way. There is a ton of stuff that we don't know about Jesus. Was he right-handed or left-handed? Right? Like, what was his favorite thing to do on his day off? Like, how did he catch fish? There's a ton of detail about his life that we don't know. But there's one that we do, and it's kind of odd. While it was still night, way before dawn, he got up and went out to a secluded spot and prayed. Simon and those went with him, went looking for him. They found him and said, everyone's looking for you. Check this out. Everyone's looking for you. Translated, you're needed. And you're not there. You're disappointing people. Like, everyone's looking for you. Who's the everyone? The lepers? Women who couldn't have kids? Like, they know you can help them, and yet you've made a conscious decision to avoid helping them. Talk about permission. In Luke 6, as soon as the meal was finished, Jesus insisted that the disciples get in the boat and go on ahead across to Bethsaida while he dismissed the congregation. After sending them off, he climbed a mountain to pray. This is called date night, right? Like, see, Jesus did it even. Like, you get out of here, you go to grandma's. He didn't even have a Bible. Like, we can way over-spiritualize this and assume that he was reading Torah scrolls. He didn't carry Torah scrolls around. What was it? It was this discipline of solitude. In John 6, the people realized that God was at work among them and what Jesus had just done. They said, this is the prophet for sure, God's prophet right here in Galilee. Jesus saw that in their enthusiasm, they were about to grab him and make him king. So he slipped off and went back up to the mountain to be by himself. And for those of you that are like, dude, I cannot sit alone and do anything, like it's torture. Well, one of the things you learn when you go to Israel is Jesus didn't either. These places of solitude, he wasn't inventing new ones. There were these places all over Israel, and particularly the Galilee, and the rabbis went to them. And most of them involved pretty arduous hikes, some of them even climbs. We've had the privilege of participating in some of them. It doesn't always mean that he sat there in like the David pose. Was that like Michelangelo, that thing, right? It's not always what he was doing. It's just about being disconnected. Yesterday I was running up the South Hills Road there from, I forget the name of the street. Anyway, so I was back on South Hills, and when I got to the top, it was like 8 in the morning, and when I looked down over the valley, it was kind of shocking, because I realized something was going on in the valley that I didn't know was going on in the valley, because down here, like, normally you can always pick out the cathedral, couldn't see it. There was this really heavy, dense white cloud over the whole community. Couldn't see any of that stuff. And as I was thinking about just the role of solitude, it struck me in that moment, like, this is the deal. Because if I would have never left the valley and went up there and to be alone, if you will, metaphor, I'd have never known what I was dealing with down in the valley. They say they're overconnected. Like, what's the cost if we don't learn to disconnect in ways that are suiting to our makeup and DNA? I also saw a demon while I was up there. His owners call him a Doberman Pinscher. Like, running along the road, I'm a little uncomfortable because of how far away. You're not that far, but you're far enough to know that you're alone. And then there's this massive house on top of the hill, and I hear barking. I'm like, okay, that's okay, because I just had a dog follow me half a mile. He was nice. And then I look, and what's barreling at me is this like 0% body fat, pointed ear demon. And then as I checked my surroundings, there were 4 strands of barbed wire between me and it, right? Which is a total mockery of the dog. Like, somehow he was emasculated at some point in his life, and he doesn't know that those aren't a retainer, but like I should have been dead. Or that's the way I felt. What happens if we're so connected that we don't know solitude? Now, I don't know where this lands, and I hope it doesn't feel too preachy. I hope what it is for you is to begin to have a conversation with yourself, with the Lord, with people that you love and trust about, okay, so technology is shaping me. For better or for worse, it's shaping who I am. Is that good or is that bad? Maybe you're a student, and maybe for the first time in your life, you need to tell your parents that there's way too much pressure coming from them. Maybe for the first time, you've got to talk openly and honestly about how the pressures make you feel and how sometimes you want to bail from those pressures in the most unspoken of ways. Like maybe there's a need to not hide it, but to be honest. And perhaps for others of you, maybe you're a parent. And maybe there's this conviction of like, oh, geez, I'm making a monster. They're not going to know what a washing machine looks like, let alone how to turn it on. Like maybe there's some internal conversation about like strategically applying some pressure. Maybe it's related to the media. I heard of one family, this very influential, kind of very cool, cutting-edge guy, so I was shocked when I heard it, who his family, he has high school students all the way down into elementary students in his family. I think it was 2 days a week. Was it 2 or 3? 3? 3 days a week, they do a media fast. He said it was terrible when he suggested the idea. But for 3 days a week, no cell phones, no internet. I can't remember if TV's involved. I suspect that it was. He said it was terrible. And yet now, as a leader, the ideas flow. The relationship, the activity. Maybe for you, there's these really honest conversations about the media and maybe some fasting. I started doing something much less courageous than that this week, because that's scary. But for me, my routine is I try to be up by 5:30 and read for an hour and then go run for an hour. And then what happens over the last 10 years is that as my tea is being brewed, that 2 minutes that it takes for it to brew has grown into a half an hour that I look at denverpost.com and just dream of the day that the football season starts. So I created this rule like, okay, I'm not going to look at the internet till after I get back from the run, and then when I get to the office, I block 9 to noon to work on the weekend, and yet all too often I spend an hour of that answering emails, sneaking in to look at the Denver Post. So I created a couple of fasts in my life, like where I'm not looking at the internet until I get back from my run, and I'm not dealing with email or the internet at all from 9 to noon until I get back from my lunch appointment. Like maybe for you, this is a season of permission to go, yeah, it's an incredible tool, but used too often, it's an idol. But let me just pray over you, and we'll wrap up this morning. God, Lord, it can be difficult to talk candidly about this stuff without sounding like that guy, and frankly, like any addiction, Lord, there has to be a openness before we can really make any headway. And so I just pray that you would lead us in the ways that you've dreamt about leading us as you've prepared us for this weekend. That maybe for some of us, we're golden and we just get to keep sailing, and for others, there's some pretty drastic stuff that needs to happen, and for others, maybe just a tweak or two. God, we want to walk with you, and we recognize that you are a God of the margins, and yet there are fewer and fewer of those margins in our lives. So would you give us wisdom in that regard? Amen.